The forests that marked the edge of colonial settlement were not empty. They were alive with movement, with the creak of trees and wind, the ripple of rivers winding their way to the Atlantic, and the unseen paths that connected native villages, fur trading posts, and frontier farms into a tangled web of competing worlds. For those who lived on the outermost fringes of the British, French, and Dutch colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, life was a precarious balance between survival and fear. They built their homes where cleared fields met the tree-line, where a wrong turn on a hunting trail could mean never returning, and where the sound of a dog barking at night could herald not a wandering deer, but a raiding party moving silently through the dark. It was here, on this shifting border between empire and wilderness, that a strange and deeply human drama unfolded, one that few in Europe could have imagined and fewer still understood. Raids were a fact of life on this contested ground. Some were organized military expeditions, sanctioned by colonial governors or rival crowns, meant to seize territory or punish enemy settlements. Others were retaliatory strikes by native nations responding to encroachment, broken treaties, or long cycles of blood feud that reached back generations. Still others were acts of necessity, desperate attempts to capture hostages who could be exchanged for prisoners, goods, or leverage in negotiations. Women and children were often the targets, not because they were seen as trophies, but because they were valuable. In a world defined by alliances and kinship, captives could become part of family, a source of labor, or a bridge to a new peace. Colonial records are filled with terse, almost clinical account of these events, taken from a home near Deerfield, carried north toward Canada, believed alive among the Mohawk. But behind those brief lines were nights of terror and journeys that reshaped lives. Sometimes, raiders struck in the dead of winter, when frozen rivers made for quick escapes. Sometimes they came just before dawn, slipping through palisades and setting homes alight as panicked families ran into the woods. In 1704, for instance, the small town of Deerfield in Massachusetts was attacked by a combined force of French soldiers and Abenaki and Conowick warriors. 56 colonists were killed, more than 100 taken north through snow and ice toward Montreal. Among them was Reverend John Williams's wife, Eunice, who fell in the first miles of the forced march, and his young daughter, also named Eunice, who would later refuse every offer of return and remain in Conowick for life. Such stories were not isolated. Across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Great Lakes frontier, women vanished from homesteads and reappeared months or years later in places their families could barely imagine. Some were ransomed and returned, traumatized but alive. Others were adopted into native communities and came to speak new languages, bear new names, and follow new customs. A few became the wives of warriors or traders, mothers of children who straddled two worlds. In the eyes of colonial society, they were victims, symbols of savagery and barbarism. Yet for many of the women themselves, captivity was not a single event, but the start of a transformation that neither side had planned. The edge of empire was not a line on a map. It was a zone of collision, adaptation, and reinvention. Europeans brought their laws, their faith, their sense of superiority. Indigenous nations defended their homelands, forged alliances, and reshaped traditions to meet new challenges. In the middle of this, captured women became unwilling participants, and sometimes willing agents, in a slow, subtle exchange that changed both societies. Some resisted every step, longing for the settlements they had left behind. Others began to question which life truly felt like their own. The world they entered was not necessarily crueler or harsher, just profoundly different. One where their value was measured not by property or lineage, but by the ties they could forge and the families they could sustain. This was the reality of the frontier. Not a simple story of victims and captors, but one of choices forced by circumstance, of identities reshaped by experience, and of lives that defied the expectations of the empires that claimed the land. The women taken from the edge of colonial settlements were supposed to be symbols of weakness and defeat. Instead, many of them became something far more disruptive, living proof that even in an age of conquest, culture could flow both ways. The first hours after capture were a disorienting blur, a tearing away from everything familiar, and a plunge into a world that seemed to obey no rules at all. One moment a woman might be tending a garden or rocking a child to sleep, and the next she would be pulled from her home, barefoot, coatless, with nothing but the clothes on her back, driven into forest by strangers whose language she could not understand. The air that once smelled of hearth smoke and fields now reeked of sweat, pine, and gunpowder. The landscape she had known, fences, roads, church steeples, vanished behind her with terrifying speed, replaced by dense woods and winding rivers that seemed to swallow every trace of the life she had just lost. The marches were long, often lasting days or even weeks. In winter, snow clung to skirts and froze against skin. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies tormented every exposed inch of flesh. Some captives were given moccasins or scraps of hide when their shoes disintegrated, but many walked until their feet bled. Sleep was scarce, food scarcer. A handful of roasted corn or a strip of dried meat might be all they received for a day's march. At night, they huddled together beneath the stars or under makeshift shelters, surrounded by warriors speaking in rapid tones, gesturing with hands and weapons, their meaning impossible to decipher. Every rustle in the dark carried the threat of violence. Every glance from a captor seemed to promise a fate worse than death. Colonial fear of native captivity was steeped in rumors. Stories of torture, ritual execution, or enslavement passed from settlement to settlement like wildfire. These stories shaped the minds of those taken, making every mile of the march a descent into imagined horrors. Some captives prayed aloud, convinced they were being led to their deaths. Others retreated into silence, replaying in their minds the faces of loved ones they might never see again. Mothers clung to children, desperate to shield them, while older women whispered hymns under their breath, hoping that God still heard them in this strange wilderness. Yet for all the terror, the reality was often more complex than they had been taught to expect. Death did not always await them. Torture was not inevitable. Many captors, though stern and vigilant, offered water, shared food, or helped the weakest over swollen rivers. The treatment of captives varied widely among nations and even among individual war parties, shaped by motives that ranged from revenge to diplomacy, from adoption to ransom. Some captives were carefully guarded, destined to be exchanged for prisoners held by colonial authorities. Others were treated less like prisoners and more like possessions, expected to march but not harmed unless they tried to flee. The greatest barrier was not the threat of violence, but the wall of incomprehension that separated captors from captives. Without a shared language, every order sounded like a threat. Every laugh seemed sinister. Every sudden halt in the march felt like a prelude to execution. Over time, small cracks appeared in that wall. A gesture toward fire, a piece of bread pressed into a captive's hand, a word repeated until its meaning became clear. These moments did not erase the fear, but they complicated it, planting the first seeds of doubt about what lay ahead. By the time the marches ended and the villages came into view, clusters of lodges rising from riverbanks or plains, many women were physically broken but mentally sharper, having learned how to watch faces, read tone, and sense danger without words. They had discovered that their captors were not faceless monsters, but people with their own hierarchies, traditions, and motives. It was a realization that did not erase the trauma of capture, but reframed it. The terror of those first days would linger for years, shaping every memory of captivity. Yet it was also the moment when the story began to shift, when fear started to give way to curiosity, when hatred and dread softened into a need to understand, and when survival demanded not just endurance but adaptation. In that uneasy space between terror and comprehension, the rest of their lives would unfold. For many women, the first days in a native village were defined by the overwhelming sense of dislocation. The sights, sounds, and routines were unlike anything they had ever known. The noise of animals and children replaced the hushed stillness of colonial homes. The smell of wood smoke, cornmeal, and tanning hides drifted to the air instead of hearth fires and baked bread. Houses were not square timber dwellings with shuttered windows, but long, communal structures woven from bark and saplings, or domed lodges covered in hides and mats. Life here followed a rhythm that did not revolve around church bells or market days, but around the cycles of the earth. Planting, harvesting, hunting, and ceremonies timed to the turn of the seasons. To a captive still haunted by the trauma of her capture, this world at first felt alien, even hostile. Yet slowly, its structure revealed itself. Days began early, often before sunrise, with women and girls tending fires, grinding maize into meal and preparing food for the day. Agricultural work was central to village life, and many captives, especially those adopted into families, were expected to join in planting and harvesting corn, beans, and squash. The work was hard but collective. Fields were shared responsibilities, and cooperation was valued more than competition. For women accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of colonial society, where their labor was often confined to household and judged by patriarchal expectations, this communal approach could feel strangely liberating. Life did not stop with agriculture. Women took part in processing hides, crafting pottery, weaving mats, and making clothing from animal skins and plant fibers. These were not just domestic tasks, but acts of cultural expression, each carrying specific techniques, patterns, and meanings passed down through generations. Some captives struggled with the unfamiliar skills, their clumsy attempts a source of quiet amusement among those who had grown up mastering them. Others excelled, discovering talents they had never been asked to use before. Over time, many found satisfaction in their new roles, not because they had forgotten their past, but because they realized their labor mattered here in a way it often had not in their old lives. Child rearing, too, took on a different shape. Whereas colonial society tended to isolate mothers and children within the nuclear family, Native communities practiced shared responsibility. Infants were passed easily from one pair of arms to another. Older children helped care for younger ones, and discipline was often gentle but firm, rooted in community expectations rather than strict paternal authority. Captive women who arrived with children of their own sometimes found the system unsettling at first, fearing they would lose control. Yet many came to appreciate the support it offered, the way the burden of motherhood was shared across the village. Even those without children were often drawn into caregiving roles, teaching, comforting, and guiding, contributions that earned them respect and a sense of belonging. The social fabric of these communities could surprise outsiders. Far from being chaotic or lawless, they were structured by kinship networks that dictated responsibilities, inheritance, and political authority. Councils of elders made decisions collectively, and women often held significant influence, particularly in matters of family, property, and diplomacy. Some captives, once considered powerless within patriarchal colonial societies, now found themselves consulted in decisions affecting the household or even the larger community. It was a shift that challenged everything they had been taught about gender and authority. Evenings were marked by storytelling, feasting, and ceremonies that blended the sacred with the everyday. Music, dance, and oral tradition connected the present to the past, weaving captives into a narrative larger than themselves. Many were given new names during adoption ceremonies, names that reflected qualities admired by their adoptive families or significant moments from their lives. It was symbolic rebirth, an acknowledgement that while their past was not erased, they now belonged to this community too. Not all captives embraced this life. Some resisted every expectation, holding fiercely to their old identities and dreaming of escape. But others, perhaps more than colonial chroniclers were willing to admit, found a sense of purpose in place that had eluded them in the settlements, in the daily rhythms of planting and storytelling, in the shared labor and shared authority. They encountered a different vision of society, one that, despite its strangeness, offered stability, respect, and even affection. Over time, many realized that what had begun as survival had quietly become something more: participation, integration, and, for some, a new definition of home. For those who survived the march and the uncertainty of their first days, captivity often reached a moment of profound transformation, one that confounded every expectation they had carried with them from the world they left behind. In many indigenous nations, a captive who was not destined for ransom or execution did not remain a captive at all. Instead, they were brought into the heart of the community through elaborate and deeply symbolic ceremonies of adoption, rituals designed not simply to erase their past, but to graft them into a living family tree. These ceremonies were neither acts of cruelty nor mere political gestures. They were sacred performances of belonging, rooted in beliefs about kinship, balance, and renewal that stretched back generations. For many colonial women, the first sign that something unusual was happening came with water. A washing was often the opening act of adoption, a cleansing of the body and, symbolically, the soul. It was not the harsh scrubbing of a prisoner, but a careful, deliberate ritual. Women of the village would lead the captive to a river or stream, washing away the grime of the journey. but also, in their view, washing away the ties to her old identity. The water was more than water. It was a boundary between two lives, one now behind her and one waiting to begin. When she emerged, she was no longer a stranger carried from a distant settlement. She was someone reborn, ready to enter the community as kin. After the cleansing, names followed. In European tradition, names were given at birth and remained fixed, markers of lineage and inheritance. But here, names were fluid, earned, and bestowed as a sign of new life. A captive might receive a name linked to an event, she who came with the snow, or one reflecting a quality admired by her new family. Patient heart, quiet water, or one who walks far. Sometimes the names were echoes of ancestors, meant to continue a lineage that death had interrupted. A fallen daughter or sister lost in war or disease might now live again in the person standing before the fire, her memory preserved and renewed through the act of naming. To colonial observers, this seemed like erasure. To those who performed it, it was resurrection. Ceremonies vary by nation, but many share common elements. The presentation of gifts, the exchange of food, the public proclamation of kinship before the community. The act was as much for the people as for the individual. It reaffirmed the bond that held them together and the values that defined them: compassion, strength, endurance, and renewal. Adoption was not a humiliation but an elevation, a declaration that the newcomer was worthy of protection, respect, and obligation. They were no longer a captive to be pitied or a servant to be commanded. They were daughter, sister, mother, or wife. They were expected to fulfill those roles, and they were entitled to the rights that came with them. This concept of kinship confounded colonial categories. In European societies, the line between slave and citizen, foreigner and subject, was often rigid and legally enforced. But in many indigenous cultures, identity was relational. It was not what you were born as, but what you became through connection and responsibility. A person who entered the circle through ceremony was no less a member than one born into it. This meant that a woman who had once been dragged from her home at knife point could, months later, be calling the people who took her family without contradiction or irony. The emotional experience of this transformation was complex. Some women resisted, clinging fiercely to their old names and faith, refusing to participate in rituals they considered heathen. Others, exhausted by grief and displacement, found solace in the structure and meaning the ceremonies offered. There are accounts of captives weeping openly as they were named, not out of despair, but because the ritual marked the first moment of acceptance they had felt since their capture. What began as a story of violence and loss now unfolded into one of belonging and possibility. Colonial officials and missionaries who later encountered these women were often baffled, even horrified, by their transformation. How could a woman raised in a Christian home speak of her captors as her people? How could she refuse offers of ransom or return? They could not see that the ceremonies had not erased her identity but rewritten it, layering new meaning atop old memories. In the logic of the village, she had not been stolen. She had been reborn. These rituals of transformation were not footnotes in the story of captivity. They were its turning point. They marked the moment when women stopped being outsiders and started being something else entirely, participants in a system of kinship older and more enduring than the empires that claimed the land. Through water, names, and the quiet power of community recognition, they crossed a threshold that changed not only how others saw them, but how they saw themselves. And in that change lay the heart of a story that no colonial authority had prepared for: the possibility that captivity could become home. For women who were taken captive and later gave birth, or who were captured with their children beside them, the most difficult decisions were not about their own lives at all. They were about the futures of those children, futures that lay suspended between two worlds that often refused to acknowledge each other. Once adoption ceremonies were complete and daily routine set in, the question of identity became more than personal. It became generational. What language would the children speak? What stories would they inherit? Would they grow up seeing themselves as members of the village that had taken them in, or as exiles from a distant settlement they had never truly known? Many women discovered quickly that the two paths diverged sharply. Life in indigenous communities, though foreign at first, offered children a sense of belonging from the beginning. They were woven into the fabric of communal life, taught to run to the woods barefoot, to recognize plants and seasons, to learn the myths and histories of the people who now called them kin. They participated in ceremonies, listened to elders around fires, and learned to see the world not as a hierarchy of rulers and subjects, but as an intricate web of relationships between people, animals, spirits, and land. For many mothers, watching their children thrive in this environment brought unexpected peace. Whatever had happened to them personally, they saw their sons and daughters laughing, strong, and secure, and that mattered more than anything else. Yet there was always another voice, quieter but insistent, whispering of the world left behind. In colonial society, lineage and inheritance were everything. A child's identity was tied to its father's name, its family's property, and its place within the strict social order. Women who thought returning often did so not for themselves, but because they believed their children would have greater opportunities there, education, religion, safety, and legitimacy in the eyes of the empire. But return was never simple. Even when captives were ransomed or managed to escape, they found that children raised among native people were often seen as tainted, their loyalty suspect, their manners and language strange. Some colonial families refused to accept them at all. Others demanded they be re-educated, stripped of everything they had known in order to be made civilized. For mothers, the thought of watching their children endure that humiliation was often unbearable. Historical accounts tell of women who faced choices that no one should ever have to make. Some chose to stay in the villages where their children felt at home, even if that meant never seeing their relatives again. Others attempted to flee, carrying infants through forests under the cover of night, only to be recaptured or to lose their way. Still others made compromises, returning to colonial settlements but allowing their older children, now deeply enmeshed in native life, to remain behind, knowing that forcing them back would mean tearing them apart from everything they knew. These separations left scars that lasted generations. Letters and petitions survived from fathers and brothers who begged for return of lost children, unaware or unwilling to accept that those children no longer saw themselves as lost at all. There were rare instances when children themselves became the decision-makers. Older boys and girls, especially those captured young, often identified completely with the communities that had raised them. Colonial negotiators reported with astonishment that teenagers offered chances to come home, refused outright, preferring to remain with their adoptive families. Mothers had to live with the consequences of those choices too, watching children they loved choose a path that excluded them, yet also knowing that forcing them to leave would mean destroying their sense of self. Religion complicated the dilemma even further. Many colonial women had been raised to believe that salvation could only be found within Christianity. The thought of their children growing up heathen filled them with dread, but conversion worked both ways. Children who grew up hearing the stories of Sky Woman or the Great Turtle, or who participated in seasonal ceremonies and sacred dances, often found those traditions as natural and sacred as the psalms their mothers once sang. Some women quietly blended the two worlds, teaching Bible verses alongside oral stories, baptizing children in rivers that were also home to ancestral spirits. Ultimately, the struggle over children's identities revealed something deeper than cultural conflict. It showed how captivity blurred the lines between us and them in ways no colonial government or missionary could fully control. These women's decisions were not abstract questions of loyalty or ideology. They were intimate, painful calculations made in the quiet moments of motherhood, between protection and opportunity, belonging and rejection, love and loss. No matter which choice they made, it was never clean or complete. Some mothers spent their final years longing for the faces they had left behind. Others never looked back, convinced that they had given their children a better life. And many lived with the ache of knowing that their children would forever carry the imprint of two worlds, never entirely at home in either, but also never entirely excluded from both. Back in the towns and farms where the women had been taken from, the story did not simply end with their disappearance. For those left behind, the absence became its own relentless presence, a wound that refused to heal. Husbands, fathers, siblings, and children lived suspended between hope and despair, clinging to rumors, reports, and prayers that grew fainter with each passing season. At first, there was action. Search parties combed the woods in the days and weeks after a raid, following tracks until they vanished into deeper wilderness. Ministers stood in pulpits and called on their congregations to pray, for the safe return of the lost. Notices appeared in colonial newspapers, printed in careful, pleading language, taken from her home near Hadley in the late incursion, believed alive among the Abenaki, any information gratefully received. These words were written for strangers, but also for the women themselves, in case they might somehow read them and know they were not forgotten. Ransom became a desperate hope. Families sold livestock, mortgaged land, and gathered donations from neighbors to pay the price that might bring a loved one home. In some colonies, committees were formed to negotiate directly with French officials or native leaders. Envoys were dispatched to Montreal or Quebec to speak on behalf of grieving communities, offering trade goods or money in exchange for captives. Treaties sometimes included provisions for the return of prisoners, and during uneasy truces between wars, emissaries carried long lists of names, daughters, wives, and sisters they prayed were still alive. Occasionally, these efforts succeeded. A wagon would arrive at a meeting house carrying a gaunt, thin woman who stepped down in silence, eyes scanning the crowd for faces she half remembered. But far more often, the answer was nothing at all. Silence was the cruelest part. Letters sent north through intermediaries never returned. Messengers came back with vague reports. She is alive but cannot be reached, or worse, with no news at all. Seasons passed. Children grew up without mothers. Husbands remarried, unsure whether they were widowers or not. The uncertainty corroded the living. A grave could be wept over, a death accepted. But this was a limbo with no resolution, a story that refused to end. The few captives who did return often carried with them another kind of silence, one they could not put into words. They had lived lives their families could not imagine, in languages they did not speak, under customs they did not understand. Their reluctance to speak of it frustrated those desperate to know what had happened. And for those who chose not to come back at all, the silence was total. Families often convinced themselves that the women must have died. The alternative, that they had willingly remained among the people who had once captured them, was too painful to accept. Colonial authorities, too, struggled with that silence. It complicated narratives of savagery and civilization. Ministers warned from their pulpits that Satan himself had ensnared the hearts of those who did not return. Pamphlets were printed describing captivity as a test of faith, a trial meant to purify the soul. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay unease. If these women were truly unwilling captives, why did so many not seize the chance to escape? Why did letters offering freedom go unanswered? Some officials blamed brainwashing or heathen influence. Others quietly admitted what they dared not say aloud, that perhaps life among their captors was not the unrelenting misery they had always claimed it to be. The emotional weight of unanswered letters lingered for generations. Family Bibles contained pages of names marked taken with no date of death beside them. Diaries spoke of dreams in which the missing returned, older but alive, walking back to the door after decades away. Church registers listed baptisms and burials, but also absentees, a word that captured the aching uncertainty of their fate. In attic chests and desk drawers, yellowing letters remained folded and unsent. Last attempts to bridge a distance that could no longer be crossed. For those who waited, time itself became a kind of captivity. Each season brought the same questions, the same rituals of hope. Watching the road for a messenger, scanning the horizon for a returning figure, listening for footsteps that never came. Some families never stopped believing, even when decades passed and the original captives were surely gone. Others hardened into bitterness, cursing the people who had taken them and the governments that had failed to bring them back. But whether through hope or anger, all were shaped by the same absence, an absence measured not just in bodies, but in the letters that were written and never answered, the prayers spoken into silence, and the stories that ended not with death or reunion, but with uncertainty that stretched across lifetimes. When peace treaties were signed or prisoner exchanges negotiated, colonial officials often expected the return of captive women to be straightforward. They imagined emotional reunions at town gates, tearful embraces, and a swift reintegration into the world from which they had been taken. What they encountered instead was something far more bewildering. Again and again, women offered freedom and passage home quietly declined. They stood before colonial envoys, listened to offers of return, and shook their heads. Some refused without explanation. Others spoke gently but firmly, explaining that the life they had built among the people who once captured them was now the only life they knew. For the authorities who recorded these refusals in their journals and reports, it was almost unthinkable. How could someone prefer the world of their captors to their own? The answer lay in the years that had passed between capture and offer. Time had a way of softening captivity into belonging. Women who had been taken in their teens were often offered return in their 20s or 30s. They had married, borne children, and woven themselves into the social fabric of their new communities. They were mothers now, wives, respected members of extended kin networks. To leave meant tearing themselves away from the people they loved and the lives they had built. It also meant taking children from fathers, grandparents, and siblings, or worse, leaving those children behind because colonial authorities refused to recognize them as legitimate heirs. Even for those who had once dreamed of returning, the cost had become too high. Some refusals were deeply practical. A woman who had lived for 15 years in a Seneca village might not even speak English fluently anymore. She might have forgotten how to read or write, or have little memory of the place she had been taken from. Returning would mean becoming a stranger in her own homeland, distrusted by neighbors, viewed as a curiosity or even a traitor. Colonial society was rarely kind to those who had lived among native nations. Their loyalties were questioned, their faith suspect, and their purity often considered compromised. Faced with the prospect of a life lived under suspicion and scrutiny, many women concluded that the world they had once called home no longer had a place for them. Others refused for reasons that were deeply emotional, even spiritual. Adoption ceremonies had not merely given them new names. They had given them new identities. They had participated in rituals, learned stories, and come to see the land itself through a different lens. The rhythms of life in native communities, communal labor, consensus decision-making, seasonal cycles of planting, harvest, and ceremony had become the structure around which their lives revolved. Returning to the rigid hierarchies and private enclosures of colonial towns felt not like liberation, but confinement. Their old lives, when remembered at all, seemed distant and pale, a chapter that belonged to someone else. Colonial negotiators, unprepared for such decisions, often resorted to coercion or manipulation. Some tried persuasion, reminding women of their Christian duty or promising them property and inheritance if they returned. Others attempted to shame them, warning that they would be condemned by God or ostracized by their communities if they refused. But these appeals often fell flat. The women's identities were no longer defined by colonial values, and the threats of a world they no longer inhabited carried little weight. In some cases, they spoke openly about their choices, declaring that they were happier, freer, and more respected in the villages that had once taken them by force. There are recorded instances that startled colonial officials more than any other, women who had come back with ransom groups but, within months, disappeared again, slipping away to rejoin the communities they had left. Their brief return had confirmed what they already knew, that the bond of kinship they had formed in captivity was stronger than the pull of blood or birth. These stories spread quickly through colonial society, unsettling the deeply held assumptions about civilization and savagery, loyalty, and betrayal. If women raised within European culture could choose to remain with those labeled heathen and barbarous, what did that say about the supposed superiority of the colonial world? The refusals were not acts of defiance so much as acts of affirmation, affirmations of identity, belonging, and agency. The women were not choosing their captors over their families. They were choosing the lives they had built, the people they loved, and the communities that had claimed them as their own. Their decisions were deeply personal, shaped by circumstance and emotion, but collectively they sent a message that could not be ignored. Captivity had not broken them. It had remade them. And when given the rarest of opportunities, the chance to walk away and return to a world they had once known, they turned toward the one they had created, choosing not the life they were born into, but the one they had built with their own hands. Religion ran like a quiet undercurrent beneath every decision, shaping how captive women understood their experiences, how they interpreted their suffering, and how they imagined their futures. For many, faith had been the foundation of life before capture. Colonial society was steeped in Christian belief, and sermons preached from pulpits taught that the world beyond European settlements was a realm of darkness, its people lost souls in need of salvation. To be seized by those considered heathens was not only a physical danger but a spiritual one, a test of faith, perhaps even a temptation. Ministers told their congregations that steadfastness in captivity would prove one's devotion to God, while conversion to indigenous beliefs would mean damnation. Yet the reality on the ground was far more complicated than those sermons imagined. Captivity did not always destroy faith, but often transformed it in unexpected ways. Some women clung fiercely to Christianity, using it as an anchor in an unfamiliar world. They whispered prayers as they walked the long miles of the forced marches, recited psalms under their breath while working in fields, and sang hymns softly to their children at night. Even when no one around them understood the words, the rhythms of prayer offered continuity, a connection to the lives they had lost. Over time, these private devotions sometimes became public. Captives taught their adoptive families how to cross themselves before meals or shared Bible stories around the fire, adapting them into oral forms that resonated with their new listeners. In some villages, Christian teaching spread not as an imposed doctrine, but as a set of stories and moral lessons woven into existing traditions. This blending was rarely deliberate, yet it subtly reshaped the spiritual landscape of both captives and captors. Others, however, found themselves drawn into the spiritual world of their new homes. Native religions were not abstract systems of belief, but living practices embedded in daily life, in the cycles of planting and harvest, in ceremonies tied to the changing seasons, in the gratitude offered to rivers, animals, and the land itself. These beliefs were not simply preached, they were experienced. Participation was expected of all community members, and captives were no exception. Women found themselves attending ceremonies, joining dances, and observing rituals that marked everything from childbirth to the first snowfall. At first, they did so as outsiders, uncertain and hesitant. But with time, many felt their meaning deeply. The reverence for nature, the emphasis on balance and reciprocity, and the sense of connection between the human and the sacred offered perspective unlike the one they had known before. For some, this led to profound internal conflict. Christianity had taught them that there was one God, one truth, and that all other beliefs were false. Yet their daily lives in the village showed them a spiritual system that was not chaotic or evil, as they had been taught, but deeply coherent, ethical, and sustaining. Some resolved the tension by rejecting their old beliefs entirely, undergoing ceremonies of adoption not just into families but into faith itself. Others tried to reconcile the two, seeing the Creator described in native traditions as the same God they had always worshipped, just understood differently. This quiet synthesis, unrecorded by official chroniclers but preserved in oral memories and family traditions, created new forms of belief that neither side fully recognized but both helped shape. Religion also played a powerful role in decisions about whether to return when given the chance. Some women refused to leave because they feared their new spiritual practices would be condemned by colonial authorities. Others returned but found themselves alienated from church life. Their perspectives forever changed. Missionaries sometimes celebrated the return of captives as victories for Christianity, yet they were troubled by the syncretic faith some women brought back with them, beliefs that blended biblical teaching with native cosmology, European liturgy with indigenous ritual. In these hybrid practices, captives had not abandoned religion, but remade it. The presence of Christianity also transformed native communities in subtle ways. It provided new language for existing beliefs, new stories to explain familiar truths, and new rituals to layer atop ancient ones. At the same time, native spirituality reshaped the Christianity practiced by captives, grounding it in a deeper respect for land and community than colonial churches often encouraged. What emerged from this exchange was not domination by one faith or the erasure of the other, but a complex and evolving spiritual landscape, one built in a space where cultures met and individuals sought meaning amid upheaval. Faith, then, was not simply a battleground in the story of captivity. It was a bridge, a shield, a tool of resistance, and a source of transformation. It shaped choices and softened divisions, offering some women the strength to hold on to their past, and others the courage to embrace a new way of seeing the world. And in that subtle blending of prayer and ceremony, psalm and chant, they left behind a legacy more enduring than conquest, a reminder that belief is not fixed in place, but bends and adapts, just as people do when two worlds meet. Love was never part of the story colonial societies told about captivity. In their version, women taken from their homes were victims to be pitted, symbols of savagery's cruelty, or souls to be rescued and returned. What they could not imagine, and what historical records repeatedly reveal, is that many of those women built lives shaped not only by survival but by affection. Over time, bonds of kinship, friendship, and even romantic love grew in places where fear had once lived, crossing cultural boundaries that colonial authorities believed were insurmountable. These connections were not exceptions. They were common, and they reveal a far more complex reality than the one described in sermons and broadsheets. Adoption was often the first form of kinship a captive encountered, and it laid the foundation for everything that followed. In many indigenous nations, adoption was not a legal procedure, but a deeply emotional act. Families grieving the loss of a daughter, sister, or wife would symbolically replace her by bringing a captive woman into their household. The relationship was not one of ownership but of reciprocity. The newcomer was expected to contribute to household, but she was also protected, cared for, and woven into the family's social fabric. Over time, these bonds could become indistinguishable from those formed by birth. Sisters laughed together while grinding corn or weaving mats. Mothers and daughters shared stories and rituals. Grandmothers offered advice and comfort. For many captives, these relationships provided a sense of belonging that softened the memory of how they had come to be there. Marriage followed a similar logic, though it carried deeper social and political significance. Unions between captives and members of their adopted communities were not uncommon, especially if the women had been captured young or had lived in the village for many years. Sometimes these marriages were arranged, strengthening alliances between families or clans. Sometimes they grew organically from mutual affection. Shared labor in the fields, long conversations by the fire, the slow trust that built over years. Whatever their origin, these marriages were binding and sincere. Captive women often became wives not in the sense of property, as colonial law might define them, but as partners, their voices valued in household decisions and their status respected. They bore children who carried the blood of two worlds and were welcomed without question into the lineage of their fathers. Love, once unthinkable between captor and captive, was often a quiet and deeply human reality. There are accounts of women who spoke tenderly of husbands they had once feared, who described their marriages as happy, their children as beloved, and their lives as fulfilling. These bonds were not born of coercion alone. They were shaped by shared experiences, mutual dependence, and the slow erosion of cultural boundaries in the face of daily intimacy. Many colonial observers refuse to believe these stories, dismissing them as a result of brainwashing or Stockholm Syndrome centuries before the term existed. But those explanations fail to account for the agency and choice many women demonstrated, particularly those who were offered the chance to leave and chose instead to stay with the families they had built. Kinship extended beyond marriage. Friendships formed across lines of origin, and social networks grew that bound captives to their communities in ways that went far beyond necessity. They became godparents, midwives, storytellers, and advisors. They played roles in ceremonies and councils, their perspectives value for the bridges they could build. In some cases, their presence even reshaped the political landscape. Marriages between captives and leaders could forge alliances between warring nations or strengthen trade relationships. Children of mixed ancestry sometimes became mediators in conflicts, fluent in multiple languages and cultures. Colonial society viewed these relationships with suspicion and alarm. Officials lamented the loss of women who had married native men and refused to return, interpreting their decisions as betrayal. Ministers preached sermons about purity and loyalty, warning that such unions blurred the lines between civilization and barbarism. Yet those same officials and preachers could not deny the reality before them. Cultural boundaries were not as impermeable as they had imagined. Love, kinship, and family had a power that outstripped ideology. For the women themselves, these relationships often transformed captivity into something far different from what it had been at the start. The terror and alienation of the early days gave way to connection, purpose, and belonging. They were no longer outsiders, but mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters, positions of dignity and responsibility that gave their lives shape and meaning. And in many cases, They came to see their new families not as replacements for what they had lost, but as expansions of it, bridges rather than walls between the world they had been born into and the one they had come to know. In the end, the bonds they formed speak to something deeper than politics or conquest. They reveal a truth that colonial authorities could neither predict nor control, that the human need for connection, for love and kinship, can thrive even in the aftermath of violence. And once those bonds were formed, they were often stronger than fear, stronger than memory, and stronger than the divisions that had once seemed impossible to cross. By the time years had passed and their identities had rooted firmly into their new lives, many former captives found themselves in positions that neither their birth societies nor their adoptive ones had fully anticipated. They were no longer merely survivors of a traumatic event, nor simply members of their adopted communities. They had become something else entirely. Intermediaries who could move between two worlds, speak the languages of both, and understand the customs, fears, and ambitions that shaped them. In a landscape defined by mistrust and conflict, such people were rare and invaluable. Women who had once been taken from their homes now carried the power to shape the course of diplomacy, trade, and even war. Language was often the first bridge they built. A woman captured young might grow up speaking her adoptive nation's tongue as fluently as her own, sometimes even more so. Those who were taken as adults learned to navigate two vocabularies, switching between them with ease, translating not just words but ideas and intentions. They explained European legal concepts and religious beliefs to native councils and, in turn, translated complex indigenous worldviews for colonial negotiators. In an era when misunderstanding could ignite violence, their ability to convey nuance, a concept of land use, a spiritual obligation, a promise made in good faith, could mean the difference between war and peace. But their influence went far beyond language. Many of these women understood the subtle codes of both societies, the gestures, the hierarchies, the rhythms of decision-making, and used that knowledge to smooth negotiations that might otherwise have failed. They knew when silence was a sign of contemplation rather than refusal, when a gift signified trust, and when a pause in talks was a calculated test. Their very presence at councils sometimes softened hostility. A woman who had kin ties in both a colonial settlement and a native village could speak to both sides not as an outsider, but as family, invoking obligations and relationships that no treaty parchment could capture. Trade networks, too, were shaped by their influence. Many women served as go-betweens for the exchange of goods, facilitating trust where suspicion might otherwise have prevailed. They could vouch for the reliability of a trading partner, explain the significance of an offered wampum belt, or broker terms that acknowledge the expectations of both sides. In some cases, they even managed trade themselves, overseeing the exchange of furs, tools, and textiles, and creating economic ties that outlasted the conflicts that had once divided their peoples. Their dual identity made them uniquely suited to such roles. They were insiders to both worlds, yet beholden to neither. Their presence was felt most profoundly in matters of diplomacy. As wars flared and treaties were drafted, women who had once been captives became trusted advisors and emissaries. Some sat in on councils and relayed messages that others could not, their words carrying more weight precisely because they embodied the possibility of connection. Others worked quietly behind the scenes, persuading skeptical elders to consider peace or explaining to colonial officials why certain terms were unacceptable. Their influence was not always recorded in official documents. Often their names do not appear in treaty texts, but their fingerprints are visible in the compromises and accommodations that those treaties represent. These roles were not always easy to inhabit. Acting as a cultural bridge often meant belonging fully to neither world, and mistrust was a constant companion. Colonial leaders sometimes suspected these women of divided loyalties, fearing that their sympathies lay with their adoptive families. Meanwhile, some indigenous leaders worried that their connections to the colonial world might make them unreliable. Yet despite the suspicion, both sides continued to rely on their skills, because no one else could do what they did. They were living evidence that two seemingly irreconcilable cultures could, in fact, understand one another if someone stood in the space between them. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of these women was the way they reshaped identity itself. In their hands, identity was not a fixed inheritance, but a flexible tool, a bridge rather than a boundary. They demonstrated that cultural differences were not insurmountable barriers, but opportunities for translation, adaptation, and synthesis. Their children often embodied the same duality, speaking multiple languages and moving comfortably between villages and towns, carrying stories and traditions across borders drawn by war and politics. In a world where conflict was often fueled by fear of the unfamiliar, these women proved that familiarity could change everything. They were not diplomats in the formal sense, yet they negotiated peace. They were not merchants by trade, yet they built networks of exchange. They were not lawmakers, yet they shaped the agreements that defined the balance of power. And though their names have largely vanished from the written record, their influence lingers in the treaties that ended wars, in the trade routes that linked nations, and in the families and communities that continued to blend languages, customs, and beliefs long after the era of captivity had passed. The colonial reaction to the phenomenon of women refusing to return, embracing new families, and becoming bridges between cultures was one of deep unease, even horror. It was not just the loss of individuals that disturbed colonial leaders, though that alone was a bitter blow to families and communities, but the unsettling implications those choices carried. They challenged everything Europeans believed about their own superiority, their religion, their civilization, and their right to dominate the continent. If women, raised from birth within the supposed blessings of Christianity and European culture, could abandon all voluntarily, what did that say about the strength of those institutions? And if they could find fulfillment, even happiness, among people labeled savages, then perhaps the world was not as clearly divided into civilized and barbaric as colonists like to imagine. The first and most powerful response came from the pulpit. Ministers warned congregations that the women who had remained behind had been led astray by the devil, their souls corrupted by heathen influences. Sermons described captivity as a spiritual battlefield, with Satan using false kinship and pagan rituals to ensnare the faithful. Even those who returned were not exempt from suspicion. Ministers demanded public confessions and penance, urging the redeemed to cleanse themselves of the pollution they had acquired in their time away. Captivity narratives, part testimony, part propaganda, were published and circulated widely, portraying native life as brutal and depraved, and any woman who embraced it as a victim of coercion or witchcraft rather than a person who had made a conscious choice. These accounts were meant to reassure colonial society that their worldview remained intact, that no rational Christian would ever choose to live outside it. Yet beneath the fire and brimstone lay a deeper fear, the fear of assimilation. Colonial leaders understood that their authority depended on maintaining strict social and racial boundaries. The colonies were built on the belief that European culture, religion, and governance were inherently superior and must remain uncontaminated. The idea that identities could blend, that a woman could be both English and Mohawk, both Puritan and practitioner of native ceremonies, threatened the entire ideological foundation of colonial expansion. Pamphlets, broadsides, and even laws began to warn against going native. Officials portrayed indigenous societies as seductive traps, places where weak-willed settlers might be lured away from their duty to God and King. The fear of blurred identities soon found its way into policy. Colonial governments enacted stricter regulations on cross-cultural contact, particularly between women and native men. Laws were proposed, and in some places enacted, that criminalized marriages between colonists and indigenous people or stripped women who defected of property rights and inheritance claims. Children born of such unions were often denied legal recognition, their ambiguous status, a living reminder of the boundaries colonial authorities were desperate to maintain. Frontier missions were tasked not only with converting native peoples, but also with rescuing captives, even those who did not wish to be rescued. On the ground, these policies were accompanied by acts of violence and retaliation. Settlements that suspected women of willingly staying among native nations sometimes launched raids under the guise of recovery, taking people against their will and returning them to colonial society, where they were treated more as cautionary tales than as survivors. Communities held public fasts and days of repentance after news spread of women who refused to return, framing their decisions as evidence of divine judgment. The rhetoric grew more intense as stories multiplied. Ministers spoke of unnatural affection, a phrase used to describe the love captives expressed to their adoptive families, and claimed it was proof of spiritual corruption. Newspapers printed lurid accounts of lost women, exaggerating their suffering to discourage others from sympathizing with them. Even within households, the backlash was deeply personal. Families often refused to speak of daughters or sisters who had chosen to stay behind, erasing them from family records or referring to them only in whispers. Others reacted with anger and shame, accusing them of betraying their blood, their faith, and their people. Some went to their graves believing that their loved ones had been bewitched or forced to remain, unable to accept that the decision had been voluntary. This refusal to acknowledge agency was itself a coping mechanism, a way for colonial society to preserve its sense of moral order. And yet, for all the sermons and laws and angry denunciations, the phenomenon did not stop. Women continued to choose indigenous life over colonial society, and their choices continued to unsettle the ideological boundaries that empire tried to draw. In fact, the louder the warnings grew, the clearer it became that those boundaries were already breaking down. People were not staying in their assigned places. Cultures were mixing. Families were forming across opposed divides, and identities were becoming too entangled to separate. The colonial backlash, furious, fearful, and often cruel, was, at its core, an acknowledgement of this reality. It was a sound of a world struggling to contain something it could no longer control. The messy, human truth that contact changes both sides, and that once hearts and lives across those boundaries, they cannot easily be forced back. For those women who did decide to return, whether through ransom, negotiated release, or their own difficult choice, the homecoming they had imagined often bore little resemblance to the reality that awaited them. Many had spent years dreaming of the moment they would cross back over the colonial boundary, imagining the embrace of loved ones, the warmth of familiar hearths, and the comfort of a language and faith they had never fully forgotten. But what they found instead was suspicion, judgment, and a subtle but unshakable distance that marked them as changed, as other, and sometimes as unwelcome. The same communities that had prayed for their return now looked upon them with unease, unsure how to reconcile the women who had left with the women who came back. The first shock came from the people closest to them. Husbands who had remarried in their absence did not always welcome them home. Children who had grown up without their mothers saw strangers standing in the doorways of their homes. Parents and siblings who had spent years mourning their loss were often bewildered by the people they had become. Women who spoke with foreign inflections, who dressed differently, who seemed more at ease in the rhythms of native life than in the rigid routines of colonial society. Even their silences could be unsettling. Many found it impossible to speak openly about what they had lived through, or unwilling to explain choices that those around them would not understand. That silence was often misread as guilt, shame, or defiance. The broader community was even less forgiving. Colonial society had little room for ambiguity, and these returned women embodied it in ways that made people deeply uncomfortable. Ministers urged them to confess their sins publicly, not sins they had actually committed, but the sin of living among heathens, of participating in rituals, of perhaps marrying or bearing children outside of Christian marriage. Some churches required lengthy penance before allowing them to take communion again. In certain towns, they were barred from positions of influence in the community, and in others they were spoken of in whispers as cautionary examples. There were even cases where returning women were accused of witchcraft, their knowledge of native languages and ceremonies interpreted as evidence of dangerous, unholy power. Even when formal accusations did not arise, social ostracism was common. Neighbors kept their distance. Invitations stopped arriving. Some women were denied work or excluded from charitable assistance, their reputations too tainted for polite society. It was not uncommon for returned captives to move to distant settlements rather than remain in places where every sideways glance reminded them of how deeply they no longer belonged. For many, reintegration was so painful that they eventually went back to the communities they had left, preferring a life where they were accepted to one where they were constantly judged. The children of these women often bore the heaviest burdens. Those born during captivity were frequently treated as outsiders, denied the inheritance rights that would have been theirs had their parentage been proper. They were teased by peers, their appearance or mannerisms marked as evidence of their mixed heritage. Some were forcibly removed from their mothers and placed with colonial families to be re-educated, severing the bonds that had formed during captivity. Mothers who had once clung to the hope of raising their children within the safety of colonial society sometimes watched helplessly as that society rejected them both. Yet even amid rejection, some women tried to bridge the gap. They became translators, guides, or intermediaries, hoping that their hard-won knowledge might make their communities more secure or more understanding. A few found niches for themselves as cultural brokers, teaching colonial officials how to negotiate or mediating disputes with native nations. But even their usefulness did not erase the suspicion that followed them. The very skills that made them valuable, their knowledge of native languages, customs, and political systems, were also the source of fear. Were they truly loyal? Could they be trusted? The questions lingered, unspoken but heavy, shaping how others saw them and how they saw themselves. In private moments, many of these women confessed that they felt they belonged nowhere. They had been outsiders in their adoptive communities before they were embraced, and now they were outsiders once more in the places where they had been born. They had crossed a boundary that could not easily be uncrossed, and the transformation that captivity had wrought in them, in their identities, their loyalties, their very sense of self, could not simply be undone by stepping back into familiar surroundings. Some carried that dislocation with them for the rest of their lives, drifting from settlement to settlement, never fully at home. The irony was painful. The society that had so desperately mourned their absence now seemed incapable of welcoming them back. In their presence, colonial assumptions about identity, purity, and loyalty were tested and often found wanting. They had been taken against their will, had endured and survived, and yet survival itself made them suspect. Their stories remind us that captivity did not end with release, and that homecomings were not always happy endings. For many women, the journey home was simply the beginning of a new and more subtle kind of exile, one lived not in distant villages, but among their own people. Some stories vanish from the page almost as soon as they begin. A woman's name appears in a colonial record, a minister's ledger, a family Bible, or a hastily printed broadside describing the taken. And then it ends. No ransom, no return, no letter carried back by a prisoner exchange. Her trail stops there, leaving families in towns and villages to wonder what became of her. To colonial officials, these women were lost, erased by silence. Yet silence does not mean absence. Though their names may have faded from European documents, their lives often continued on paths that left deep imprints elsewhere, in native villages, in children born and raised, in oral traditions passed from one generation to the next. These were the women who disappeared from the colonial world only to reappear, unacknowledged, as ancestors in indigenous memory. The reasons for this disappearance were as varied as the women themselves. Some were captured young, too young to carry strong ties to the families they had left behind. For them, the life they grew into was the only life they truly remembered, their past a dim echo that lost its hold with each passing year. Others made conscious choices when ransom or escape became possible, choosing not to return to communities that would judge them harshly for marriages they had made or the children they had borne. Still others found that after years of absence, there was nothing left to return to. Husbands remarried, parents dead, siblings scattered, land sold. In such cases, the village that had adopted them offered continuity, and belonging with the old world offered only ghosts. Oral traditions preserved their presence more clearly than colonial archives. In stories told around fires or repeated during ceremonies, women once taken in war became matriarchs of clans, their names woven into kinship lines and their memory honored as part of the community's history. Elders remembered them not as captives, but as mothers, teachers, and healers. Some were said to have brought new songs or prayers from their childhood faith, folding them into indigenous practices. Others taught farming techniques, weaving skills, or recipes that became so naturalized in the community that their foreign origin was eventually forgotten. Their lives, once marked by rupture, became threads of fabric too tightly woven to pull apart. For colonial society, however, their absence was a wound left open. Families spoke of them in hushed tones or not at all, unsure whether to consider them dead, missing, or willfully gone. Ministers used their disappearances as warnings, cautioning congregations against the temptations of life among native peoples. Official records left blanks where names might have been filled in or noted simply lost to the Indians. Yet these gaps say as much about colonial discomfort as they do about the women themselves. The silence in European accounts was not only because information was scarce, but because acknowledgement was dangerous. To admit that these women had not been destroyed but had chosen new lives was to admit that the frontier was not a line dividing civilization from savagery, but a permeable space where identities could shift and cultures could mingle. The children of these women carried the story forward in ways that could not be erased. They grew up speaking their fathers' languages, taking their places in councils, hunting parties, and planting fields. But they also carried traces of their mother's past. Word of English or French passed down in lullabies, heirlooms hidden in baskets, or features that marked them as descended from elsewhere. Over generations, these traces blended into broader community, leaving only whispers of origin. In some native oral histories, however, the memory remained sharp. The story of the woman who came from the East, who brought her children with her, who became the grandmother of a line still present today. To the colonial world, they were shadows, names that stopped in mid-sentence. To the communities they joined, they were foundations. Their erasure from one archive and survival in another tells a story about power, about who gets remembered and who is forgotten. It also reveals the quiet strength of women who, faced with impossible circumstances, built lives that endure beyond the reach of societies that had once claimed them. Their absence haunted the towns that lost them, but their presence lived on in villages where memory was not written on paper, but carried in the living voices of descendants. And though we may never know all their names, their legacy is still there, hidden in the shadows of colonial silence, brightly present in the stories that refuse to let them disappear. Long after the raids ended and the treaties were signed, the stories of captive women refused to fade. They lingered in the collective imagination of both colonial and indigenous societies, taking on new shapes as they were told and retold. What began as lived experience slowly transformed into something larger, a body of memory and myth that carried far more weight than any single life could. These stories became a mirror in which each society saw its fears, its hopes, and its values reflected back. They were not just accounts of what had happened. They were tools for understanding what it meant to belong, to be free, to choose, and to change. For European settlers, captivity stories became a popular and powerful form of literature. Published as pamphlets or serialized in colonial newspapers, they were part memoir, part sermon, part warning. Some were based on the first-hand accounts of women who returned, their words edited by ministers or printers to emphasize moral lessons. Others were fabrications entirely, constructed to feed a growing appetite for tales of danger and deliverance. These narratives almost always followed a familiar arc. The innocent settler woman, seized by savage captors, enduring terrible trials, and ultimately rescued or redeemed. They were designed to reaffirm colonial identity, to present European civilization as fragile but righteous, besieged but triumphant. They also served a political purpose, justifying ongoing wars and territorial expansion by portraying indigenous people as inherently cruel and untrustworthy. Yet even within these carefully constructed accounts, cracks sometimes showed. Readers sensed the complexity in women's voices, especially in the moments where the narrative strained to explain why a captive might have been treated kindly or why she might have hesitated to leave. Some narratives included passing references to children who refused to return or to the unexpected kindness of adoptive families. These small details hinted at deeper truths that the dominant story could not fully suppress. That captivity was not always a story of unmitigated suffering, and that bonds formed across cultural lines were not easily broken. In indigenous communities, the stories took on a very different tone and purpose. Oral traditions remembered captive women not as victims, but as pivotal figures who strengthened families, revitalized clans, and ensured cultural survival. They were remembered for their resilience, their adaptability, and the gifts they brought with them. Some stories emphasized their roles as mediators or peacemakers who helped end conflicts. Others highlighted their skills as farmers, healers, or storytellers whose knowledge enriched their new communities. Over generations, the details of their origins sometimes faded, but their importance did not. They were remembered as ancestors, not outsiders who had been absorbed, but vital members of community whose choices shaped the future. Missionary reports added yet another layer to the evolving mythology. They often cast captivity in stark spiritual terms, presenting it as a struggle for the souls of women and their children. Missionaries described their efforts to redeem captives and lamented those who refused to return, portraying them as tragic examples of Christianity's fragility in the face of pagan influence. These accounts reveal as much about European anxieties as they do about the captives themselves. They show how deeply unsettling it was for colonial society to confront the fact that faith and culture were not immutable, and that even those raised in the church could find meaning and belonging elsewhere. The stories also lived on in music, art, and public memory. Ballads were composed about stolen daughters and lost wives, sung at taverns and gatherings, their melodies carrying both sorrow and warning. In paintings and prints, captive women were depicted as noble sufferers or heroic survivors, their experiences dramatized for audiences who would never see the frontier themselves. These artistic portrayals, while often distorted, ensure that the theme of captivity remained embedded in colonial culture, a shorthand for vulnerability, endurance, and a perceived clash of civilizations. Across generations, these narratives shape collective understandings of identity and belonging. They reinforce colonial notions of superiority, but also, paradoxically, revealed the permeability of cultural boundaries. They glorified the act of return, yet could not erase the fact that many captives never came back. They sought to depict indigenous societies as enemies, yet they inadvertently documented moments of cooperation, compassion, and kinship. On the native side, oral traditions continue to celebrate those same moments, preserving a more nuanced memory of a shared and complicated past. In this way, the stories of captivity became more than accounts of historical events. They became cultural touchstones, ways of thinking about who we are and who they are, about what it means to choose one's place in the world, and about how identities are formed not only by inheritance but by experience. Even today, echoes of those stories remain in historical commemorations, family genealogies, and tribal oral histories. They remind us that history is not just written in documents or carved into monuments. It is sung, spoken, retold, and reimagined. And through those retellings, the lives of women who cross boundaries and force societies to reconsider their definitions of home continue to shape how we understand freedom, identity, and the enduring power of human connection. The story of captive women, their journeys, their decisions, and their legacies was never just about the individuals themselves. It was, at its heart, about power, who wielded it, who challenged it, and how its foundations could be shaken not by armies or treaties, but by deeply personal choices. In an age when empires measured strength by territory and trade, the choices of women, whether to stay or return, to adopt or resist, to love or reject, forced those empires to confront truths they had long ignored. They showed that conquest was never absolute, that cultural boundaries were not impermeable, and that the definition of home could be far more complex than the lines drawn on a map. For colonial authorities, the decisions of captive women were a mirror they did not want to look into. They revealed that European culture was not inherently superior, because if it were, why would anyone voluntarily leave it behind? They exposed the fragility of a social order built on the assumption of European dominance, an order in which indigenous people were to be converted, assimilated, or removed, not embraced as equals or loved as family. The fact that women could cross those lines and choose a life outside the colonial framework undermined the ideological scaffolding that justified empire. It called into question the very notion of what it meant to be civilized, and whether that label had any real meaning at all. These choices also revealed the limitations of imperial control over identity itself. European powers believed they could define people by birth, subject or foreigner, Christian or heathen, white or native. But captivity blurred those distinctions. Women who crossed the frontier often became something new, bilingual, bicultural, at home in two worlds yet fully belonging to neither. Their children embodied that transformation even more clearly, living proof that bloodlines and borders were porous. The existence of such families challenged laws, traditions, and prejudices, and forced colonial societies to grapple with questions they preferred to ignore. Who was a subject of the crown if their mother was English but their father was Mohawk? Could a woman who worshipped in both a church and a longhouse still be considered a Christian? These were not abstract questions. They shaped debates about citizenship, inheritance, and allegiance for generations. Gender, too, was at the center of this quiet revolution. In European society, women were often portrayed as passive, the protected, the dependent, the ones to be saved. But the actions of captive women, shattered that illusion. They were not merely pawns in a larger conflict. They were active participants in shaping its outcome. Their decisions to stay or to leave, to teach their children one language or another, to broker peace between rival nations, had consequences far beyond their own lives. In some cases, they influenced alliances and trade routes. In others, they softened hostilities that might otherwise have erupted into war. Their agency revealed the deep, often underestimated power women wielded in colonial frontiers, a power that did not require armies or political office, but that nonetheless reshaped the world around them. Even the concept of home, which colonial societies imagined as fixed and sacred, was transformed by these stories. Home was not always the place one was born. It could be a village far from the one marked on a baptismal record. It could be a family built not through bloodlines, but through ceremony and choice. For many women, home was where they had forged relationships, raised children, and built meaningful lives, even if that meant leaving behind a world that had once claimed them. This redefinition of home reverberated far beyond individual lives. It challenged the colonial narrative that identity was destiny, that loyalty was predetermined, and that cultural belonging could only flow in one direction. By the time the 18th century drew to a close, the choices of captive women had already begun to reshape the colonial landscape. Laws and policies were forced to adapt to the reality of mixed families and bilingual communities. Diplomats learned that understanding indigenous customs was as essential to negotiation as military strength. Missionaries realized that conversion could never be a one-way process, that the gospel itself would change as it crossed cultural boundaries. And settlers, once certain of their superiority, now lived with the knowledge that their world was not as self-contained or immutable as they had believed. The empires that stretched across North America were not toppled by these choices, but they were transformed by them. They became more entangled, more plural, more uncertain. And though colonial powers continued to insist on their dominance, they could no longer claim to be untouched by the people they sought to rule. The women whose names were often forgotten in the records had shown, through the quiet force of their decisions, that power does not flow only from cannons or crowns. Sometimes it flows from the deeply human act of choosing where and with whom to build a life. And in doing so, they left a legacy far greater than any army could achieve. They redefined the meaning of belonging, and in doing so, they changed the shape of empires themselves.